Alright, we built a routing mechanism that reads routes from an object and registers it into Express using a recursive function. Since our recursive function is something that can be used in future projects, we would want to separate it out into a reusable module. Let's do that now. So in our app folder, begin by creating a folder called helpers, which will contain an index.js file. Throughout our app, we would require miscellaneous functions that help us solve common and sometimes critical tasks. It's always best to organize such functions into their own common module. In our case, we're going to call this module helpers. You may alternatively call it utils or utilities if you like. In the index.js file inside our helpers folder, begin by cutting and pasting out the router constant, and we will also move our register routes function from our routes module like so. Let me quickly adjust the indent for this code. Now the register routes function traverses the object and registers the route, but at the end we need access to the router instance, which is then mounted as the middleware into our Express core. So I'll write another function which accepts a routes object and invokes the register routes method. We'll expose this method to the outside world instead of the register routes function. Hence, I'm going to add an underscore as a prefix to the function name register routes. This is an optional notation to denote a private function, since JavaScript doesn't really provide us with the concept of private and public functions as such. The underscore doesn't do anything, but it visually denotes here that this function is not going to be available outside of this module and is private to the body of this module. Now in our route function, we'll just invoke the underscore register routes method and we'll return the instance of the router like so. Finally, using module.exports, let's expose the route method to the outside world like so. Okay, here's an interesting bit. In ES6, you can use this shorthand assignment for referring to the same thing as earlier. Now in our routes file, let's bring in the helpers module like so. I'm going to call it H and note the path here. This is because I have to first traverse out of the routes folder to get into the helpers folder to access its index.js file. Hence /helpers. Now all you need to do is return h.route and pass in the routes object. This will call the route method from the helpers module, which invokes the register routes function, which traverses the routes object, registers it, and finally we get an instance of the router at the end. Now imagine this is all you needed to do to register the routes. Won't this be easy? And guess what? Now you can just drop this helper module into any Express project and just import it as you're doing here and call h.route and pass in the routes object to register routes into Express. Simple, clean, and easy to use.